everyone. Welcome back to AP Government and Politics. This time we are going to be talking about federalism. So let's get started. So by the end of the lesson, you'll be able to explain how societal needs affect the constitutional allocation of power between the national and state governments. Now, what is federalism? Federalism is the doctrine underlying such a system of government in which power is divided between a central government and constituent political subunits. Each subunit is assigned its own significant government powers. In order for federalism to maintain itself, it must sustain this division of power by whatever means possible, including to resort to the courts to define the proper bounds of authority. The greatest challenge to maintain this is sovereignty. And just a review of what sovereignty is. Sovereignty is the supreme political power of a government to regulate its affairs without outside interference. Now, sovereignty also resides in the subunits of government as well. The distribution of national and local responsibilities to more than one sovereign power depends on how the terms national and local are defined. These definitions are important for a government based on federalism must achieve national unity for certain overarching purposes and also preserve local governments' autonomy so they can respond to diverse subsets of citizens. Now, just to quote in American Government by Dorich, they state that federalism also, but can individual citizens really be subject to two different sovereign governments at the same time? You as citizens have official status as citizens of the state where they reside and of the nation as a whole. Many take pride in both associations. What remains unclear are the obligations and duties that dual citizenship requires. Is national citizenship every citizen's primary form of identification? To what sovereign government is a citizen obligated when the nation and individual states are in conflict? Now, although these conceptual difficulties tend to be unique to a federal system, there are other forms of government that involve multiple governments or tiers of government, and these alternative forms have significant problems of their own. Now, these aims can be offensive or so this is kind of go over the differences between a confederation or confederacy and a unitary system of government. Now, you will see this term when you read the Declaration of Independence. You see the word confederation, the Articles of Confederation. This term is in there, and you will sometimes actually see this word actually in the Constitution. So what is a confederation or quote-unquote confederacy? It is a league of two or more independent states that unite to achieve certain specified common aim. So the most popular term that we see this in history is the Civil War. So the Confederacy of the United States. Contrast, a unitary system of government is the subordinates, the independent aims of constituent states of any given exists to the goals of the central whole. Hypercentralism can be a problem, which is more or less complete reliance on the central government and the extinguishing of individual state differences. These aims can be offensive or defensive military alliances. So like I stated earlier, the Civil War, where you had the North and the South who called themselves the Confederacy. Another example is the Articles of Confederation, which prescribe the rules of government of the newly independent colonies in 1788, featured 13 states entering into a firm league of friendship with each other. Now, James Madison believed that this federal system was the preferred middle ground of government types. Countries like Canada, Germany, Australia, and Switzerland have federal systems. Now, in the United States, here is where it was first established with the ratification of the Constitution in 1788, which represents the most significant breakthrough in the evolution of this government type among modern nation states. Now, the powers in the federal system. So we have these enumerated powers. This is the powers delegated to Congress in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. This section also gives Congress the prerogative to make laws that are necessary and proper, which is called the Necessary and Proper Clause, to carry out the enumerated powers in Article 1. Now, the reserved powers, those powers are expressly retained by the state governments under the Constitution. And concurrent powers are powers that are shared by both federal and state governments. So concurrent powers will be imposing taxes is a good concurrent power. Now, this table shows the powers of the federal and state governments under the Constitution. So the first column shows the federal government powers, known as the enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And then you have the state government powers, which are the reserved powers given to the states. You can kind of consider this kind of like the 10th Amendment. So any other powers that the federal government doesn't want to induce, they will give those to the states. And the shared powers, the concurrent powers, these are the shared powers that both the federal and state government share, in a federalist or federalism or federalist state. And this is the chart here. You can certainly pause it and take a better look at this particular the differences of these powers. Now, the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause is a provision of Article 6, Paragraph 2 of the Constitution that provides that the Constitution and federal laws override any conflicting provisions in the state constitutions or state laws. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. This may give rise to the doctrine of preemption, which is the constitutional doctrine that holds that when Congress acts affirmatively in the exercise of its own granted power, federal laws supersede all state laws on the matter. Now, this clause gives special weight to the federal Constitution by ensuring that it cannot be interpreted differently from state to state. And we will kind of go over where this supremacy law clause was quoted in a Supreme Court case. So we will get to those very shortly once we get into the Constitution in the next week or two. Now, the next clause is the Full Faith and Credit Clause. Now, the Full Faith and Credit Clause is the provision in Article 5, Section 1 of the Constitution that forces states to abide by the official acts and proceedings of all other states. Now, in American federalism, there have been eras of American federalism, and we'll break those down. And here they are in this little timeline here. So, state-centered federalism was from 1789 to 1819. National supremacy period. This is from 1819 to 1837. Dual federalism from 1837 to 1937. So that's like a 100-year span. Cooperative federalism from 1937 to 1990. And new federalism, which is from 1990 until now. So you can see why they have these names of the federalism period. You can see why they would have these titles based on the date ranges. So let's first start with state-centered federalism, like I stated, from 1789 to 1819. Now, the framers' vision of federalism was that other than in those policy areas clearly identified as subject to the national government's control, the military, foreign affairs, creation of currency, and so on, state governments would have full sovereignty over all matters. Now, the national government's reach was very limited during the first 30 years of the Constitution's history, rightfully so, and each state managed its own affairs. President Thomas Jefferson took office in 1801 and passed the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, which punished individuals who criticized the national government. State governments exercised a nearly exclusive role in the administration of education, family and criminal law, civil and property rights, elections, and labor relations during the same period. And as you can see here on the bottom right corner, you will see 2 QR codes, and you can actually scan the full text of the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1789. On to the next phase of federalism, that is the national supremacy from 1819 to 1837. Chief Justice John Marshall's national supremacy doctrine stated that states have extremely limited sovereign authority, while Congress is supreme within its own sphere of constitutional authority. It became most evident in McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819, which concerned the National Bank of the United States. Now, Gibbons and Ogden in 1824, the court invalidated a monopoly granted by the New York legislature covering the operation of steamboats in New York waters because the New York monopoly was in conflict with a federal license. And state legislatures thought the court was ignoring the sovereign power of the states. On to the next phase of federalism, and that is from 1837 to 1937, which is dual federalism. And dual federalism is a doctrine of federalism that holds that state authority acts as a limit on congressional power under the Constitution. In this era, it prevented Congress from addressing the hardships brought by the Great Depression. So they wanted to address the economic hardships of the Great Depression, not just economics, but there are agricultural issues and some other social issues that were going on during this time period of dual federalism, and they wanted to address those issues. And because of this concept of dual federalism within Congress, it actually prevented Congress from actually addressing some of the issues that were going on in our country. And as you can tell, in 1937, that also included World War I and World War II were going on at that time. Next phase was cooperative federalism from 1937 to 1990. And this is where the New Deal policies regulated the workplace retirement policies and other subjects traditionally ceded to the states. President FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his supporters grew increasingly frustrated with the fact that they couldn't push some of these policies. And the economic hardships of the Great Depression demanded an activist federal government and a conservative Supreme Court. And there was a shift from layer cake federalism to marble cake federalism. And a layer cake federalism is when the authority of state and federal government is district and more easily delineated. And a marble cake federalism is when state and federal authority are intertwined in an inseparable mixture. So you really could not separate the two. It's kind of one, more of like a central government in this case. And continuing on to cooperative federalism, it can also be distinguished from Marshall's doctrine of national superiority. Whenever concurrent legislative power is exercised, Congress can act in one of three ways. 1. Preempt the states altogether and assert exclusive control over the subject matter. 2. Leave the states to act on their own. Or 3. Provide that the operation of its own law depends on or is qualified by existing state laws. Now, when it comes to grants and aid and block grants, these are grants that are given by the federal government to local governments and also to specific federal initiatives. So grants and aid are grants from the federal government to states that allow state governments to pursue specific federal policies such as highway construction. On contrast, block grants are grants from the federal government to the states that may be used at the discretion of states to pursue more generalized aims. Now, the federal government has transformed from grants and aid grants to block grants. Congress has imposed coercive burdens on states that increasingly rely on federal assistance. In 1954, Congress passed the National Minimum Drinking Age Amendment, which withheld 5% of federal highway funds from any state, in which the purchase or public possession of any alcoholic beverage by a person who was less than 21 years of age is lawful. The purpose of the law was to decrease the number of serious automobile accidents among those aged 18 to 20. However, when Reagan was elected in 1980, he openly trumpeted federal initiatives to return policymaking authority to the states. He proposed to terminate the federal role in welfare and return to the states 43 other major federal grant programs. Now, when there is a voluntary transfer of power by the central government to state or local governments, it is known as devolution. Now, in New Federalism, it is described as a resuscitation of state authority. It is to put a stop to coercive actions to the states. Congress passed a series of laws that created monetary and other forms of incentives for states to assume that responsibility. They warned that states that shirked their responsibility on the matter might be forced to assume legal ownership of the waste and from private companies and will incur all the legal liability that would arise from its hazards. New York v. United States in 1992, the Supreme Court ruled that this final provision crossed the line and was unconstitutionally coercive. Congress had unlimited authority to regulate interstate commerce and had been scaled back. In U.S. v. Lopez in 1995, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress could not ban guns in school zones. Now, the real question lies, why federalism? So, obviously, there are advantages and disadvantages when it comes to having federalism in our country. So, the advantages is you have accommodation of diversity, strengthening of liberty through division of powers, encouragement of laboratories of democracy, and lastly, adaptability to changing circumstances. Now, alternatively, the disadvantages is fiscal disparities among the states, lack of accountability, and lastly, undue reliance on courts to define the rules of federalism. Now, getting into the issues of federalism, there are two issues. One, unfunded mandates are directives from the federal government to the states, requiring them to perform regulatory tasks at their own expense. And lastly, the growing crisis of big cities. Now, in the 1980s, when it came to unfunded mandates, Congress placed coercive requirements on states that receive grants and aid grants. Now, when it comes to the big cities, it also including the needs of urban poor in big cities often outstrips city tax bases, and the federal government has scaled back in support of states and cities. Now, let me ask you this. What ways do you see federalism at work in this aspect in our modern era? And then now we're going to move on to the policy making process. So I will have a link below in the description where it actually describes the policy making process. I'll have a infographic that you can look at. It goes over the whole policy making process and how Congress makes public policy from a bill to an actual law. So and public policy refers to the set of laws, regulations, and rules that affect the entire society, and that's what public policy is. So this lesson concludes our introduction to federalism. We will go over the Supreme Court cases in relation to federal that raises the issue of federalism. So please make sure that you read McCulloch versus Maryland and U.S. v. Lopez. And please make sure that you complete the briefs template that I will have attached and that will have provided to you. And please make sure you email your briefs at my email address at adunlap@madisondistrict.k12.mi.us. And I'll have that email at the bottom of your worksheet. And then next time, like I said, we'll go over those two Supreme Court cases and make sure you read those briefs, and so that way you are prepared. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll see you next time. Bye.